Since the dawn of bodybuilding, the squat has been known as the most ubiquitous exercise in existence. It's considered the king of strength and mass builders, while simultaneously building the most impressive physiques of all time. In today's video, we're going to show you how to squat pain-free while also maximizing your leg growth and strength. Something important to consider is I've literally coached thousands of athletes and clients how to do squats and do them pain-free. We're talking about different walks of life, different ages, different body shapes and structures. And when we use the 90-degree squat, not only have we been able to get people amazing results in terms of strength and size, but it actually healed their bodies and their joints so that they became pain-free throughout all areas of life. And one other thing that's really important to comprehend before we jump into the technique of squats is that a parallel squat and a 90-degree squat are not the same. A 90-degree squat will actually be significantly above parallel because we're looking at joint angles. We're not worried about our thigh in relation to the ground. We're only worried about the knee angle and the hip angle. So now I want to jump into what a proper squat looks like. We're going to cover 5 key areas, including upper body mechanics, the feet, the core, hips, and knees. Let's go ahead and get started with upper body mechanics. When we're talking about upper body mechanics on the squat, the key is posture. Now, I've already covered posture and what that entails in other videos. I'm going to have those links below, so check those out. But something to consider when it comes to posture for any exercise, especially the squat, is head positioning. We want the head to be tall and elongated while also retracted back. A lot of people let their head drop too far forward, or they'll pull their head up too high into an overly extended position. We want that head in that tall, neutral, retracted position. Once we get the head locked in, the shoulders will naturally follow, but we also want to make sure that we know what we're looking for. We want the shoulders to be pulled down and slightly back. That's going to help us engage the lats, and when the lats are engaged, it helps set our spine and our entire backside into a very firm and sturdy position so that our squat feels incredibly locked in and we can actually get to the hips even more effectively. In terms of our eye gaze and where we want our eyes to focus on when we're doing the squat, we want them to be predominantly forward and slightly down. We don't want to be yanking our head up with our eyes looking towards the ceiling, but we also don't want our eyes and our gaze to be fixed too low on the ground because that'll cause our head to drop, which will lead to this forward flexed spinal position, which is not safe and it's also not very strong. And then finally, when it comes to upper body mechanics, we want to make sure that we have a firm, strong grip on the barbell. A lot of folks just let their hands kind of passively sit on the bar while they're holding it on their shoulders. A firm, tight grip is going to help create something called concurrent activation potentiation. That's just fancy terminology for saying that it helps us stay tight. We're going to go ahead and jump into foot mechanics. Now, a lot of you may be thinking, why are we going from the head all the way down to the feet? Why not go to the core or the hips or knees first? Well, the reason why is if you lock in your upper body posture, especially your head, and then you lock in your feet, everything else in between tends to fall into place. So that's why we're going to jump into foot mechanics. When it comes to the squat, we actually want to keep the feet perfectly straight. I know that sounds odd because a lot of coaches and a lot of fitness professionals say you want to have your feet and toes rotated out when you do a squat. If you want to optimize your joint alignment, you want everything to be stacked in a straight line. You don't want your feet rotated out because that's pulling your knees out of alignment and they're no longer in line with the rest of your body, including your hips and your pelvis. So we want those feet perfectly straight, and that will typically look a little bit more internally rotated than what most folks are used to, because on a healthy foot, the front of the foot or the toe box will be wider than the heel. So if you're looking at it from the front, it's going to look slightly pigeon-toed, but we're actually more concerned about the actual ankle joint. So if you view it from the back or posterior view, what you'll notice is that when the feet look slightly rotated in, the ankle joint is actually perfectly straight, which is what we want. Once your feet are screwed into the floor, those arches are popping up, and that big toe is aggressively pressed down into the floor, you want to make sure you're still sitting back into the heels and hips. In terms of stance width, or how wide you want your feet when you squat, you can go anywhere from a wide stance to a medium stance to a closed stance. It really doesn't matter. There will be a very slightly different emphasis on which muscles will be firing a little bit more, but not that much. The key is finding a stance width that feels optimal for nailing your squat form and for locking it in. For most folks, that's going to be roughly shoulder width or hip width, which will be around 12 to 18 inches apart. Let's discuss proper core and abdominal activation when it comes to the squat. We want to make sure that the core is fully engaged by bracing the abs as hard as possible, like someone's going to punch you in the stomach. You also want to make sure that you're pulling the stomach in as hard as you can so that you're not having this excessive low back arch or excessive lumbar extension where that low back is overly arched. So pulling the stomach in and bracing it as hard as you can are going to be the two biggest cues you can have for optimizing your core mechanics and maintaining that neutral spinal position. So we've already covered upper body posture, we've covered the feet, and we've covered the core. If you dial those three components in, you'll find that the hips and the knees, which we're going to cover next, that inevitably those will naturally fall into their optimal alignment and position. But I still want to highlight those because there are a few common pitfalls. So let's start off with the hips. We talked about this with the core, about pulling our stomach or our abs in as hard as we can while keeping that upper body posture. When we pull the abs and the stomach in, what we'll find is that it naturally helps to shift the hips back posteriorly, and it helps us to shift our weight distribution back so that we don't have too much weight forward onto our knees or onto our toes. So that's the key and purpose of pulling the stomach in as hard as we can. Once the hips are set back, you should naturally feel like you have a slight hip hinge, kind of like an RDL, but it's very subtle. And it should happen so subtly that it doesn't actually cause the chest or shoulders to drop over. Again, it just causes those hips to shift back so that we can actually load the glutes. One common cue that I'm not a huge fan of when it comes to hip positioning for the squats is the glute squeeze, especially on the eccentric or lowering phase of the squat. What I've found is that if you focus too much on squeezing the glutes when you're coming down into your squat or the bottom position of your squat, the hips tend to collapse too far forward and you're not able to actually load the glutes like you'd like to. Instead, focus on pulling the stomach in, and then when you drive up into the top position, you can engage the glutes and think about squeezing the glutes without actually having the hips collapse forward where they come so far in front of your body that you actually lose optimal spinal positioning. No squat tutorial would be complete without talking about the knees. When it comes to knee mechanics, we want perfect stacking, as we've mentioned when we were talking about the feet. We want the knees, the ankles, and the hips to be stacked all the way down. This creates something called joint centration, where we have equal load or tension distribution across the entire joint. So if we're thinking about the knee, we want those forces to be coming directly through the knee, straight through the center. If our knees are collapsing inward, we have too much pressure on the inside of the knee. If our knees are rotated out excessively or bowing out, we now have unequal pressure where we have too much pressure on the outside of the knee. So again, we want those force vectors to go straight through the knee. A very common problem that many people face when they're squatting is that they're not aggressively activating their adductor muscles or those inner thigh muscles. Those muscles of the inner thighs are key for preventing excessive knee flare out, and it also helps to activate those big toe muscles, and the big toes themselves actually help activate the adductors. So one of the most important things you can think about when it comes to firing those inner thigh muscles is to actually fire or press your big toes into the ground as hard as possible. We've already talked about that when we discussed the feet. But in doing so, those inner thighs or those adductor muscles will be actually firing as they should be, and that will help to stack the knee joint so that it's not pulling out excessively, but instead is in line with the rest of the body. When it comes to how much forward knee shift we want on the squat, a lot of folks will say that you don't want your knees to travel too far forward, and some folks will say, hey, having those knees come past the toes is okay. In reality, there's an optimal balance between the two. We want to have a natural level of knee shift where they do come forward, but we don't want it to be excessive. And one of the best ways to address this is to make sure that when you're squatting, your shins or your tibia and your torso are parallel to each other. When that happens, you know you have optimal weight distribution between the hips and the knees, and that your joints are perfectly stacked and centrated. And then finally, when it comes to this topic of knee mechanics, we want to make sure that there's no lateral shifting happening when we're performing the squat. A lot of folks, when you watch them from the front view, you'll notice that their knees are kind of wavering in and out when they're squatting instead of staying really locked in and tight. So have those knees really firm when you're doing your squat simply by maintaining full body tension. Another key point to understand is that you want to feel the natural stopping point when you're doing a squat. If your posture is locked in, your core and your feet are set in their optimal position, as we've already discussed, you will feel a very natural stopping point when you do your squat. In reality, it will be the deepest squat position you can get into without sacrificing any of these optimal biomechanical principles that we've addressed. And as soon as you have to sacrifice any of those elements and go past 90 degrees, you know that you've gone too far. When in doubt, it's better to stop too short than to go too far. If you stop short, you just simply didn't get the ideal or optimal level of muscle activation. But in terms of your biomechanics, they're probably still somewhat sound. Once you go too deep, you inevitably have to compensate and sacrifice natural or ideal alignment of your body. And so once again, if you're going to stop too short or too deep or kind of mess up your ideal squat range of motion, it's better to go too short. Now, I've just covered quite a few tips in terms of optimizing your squat form. It's a lot of information. It can almost be information overload. But if you really want to simplify all of this down to just a few important elements, it comes down to this. Locking your posture, which starts with the head position, locking your feet, like we talked about, everything else in between will naturally follow, and then all the other cues and tips that I gave in this video, they should inevitably follow as well, and this will just be a natural little guide that you can use for a resource as a checklist, essentially. Just make sure that all those things are happening as they should be, and again, if your posture and your feet are locked in, they'll naturally follow. Hey guys, I'm excited to announce that my brand new book, Movement Redefined Fundamentals, is out and it's completely free. It's on my website, advancedhumanperformance.com, and it gives all the details of the 90-degree eccentric isometrics protocol, and it just gives all the fundamentals that you need to maximize your strength training and gain as much muscle as possible, as well as optimizing your joint health. So check it out. Again, it's completely free.